And good evening. It's August 30th, 2024. Welcome to another one of our Branches of the Vine with the Bible Project and their Sermon on the Mount series. So, my brother, Jim Wern, he and we've decided to watch these videos and we decided to chat about them. So, we will release our videos in 2 episodes in each week that follows. First, usually on a Thursday, we'll cover my comments and thoughts and ideas that the Bible Project has put together for us. And on the day after, again, usually a Friday, I'm going to discuss with my very cool bro, and we'll bounce around our ideas and our thoughts. So, welcome this evening to our second discussion of Episode 7, Sermon on the Mount, Praying to Our Father on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, please click that subscribe button. Reminders, they help you. But also, if these might be useful to others, then click the like button because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So again, this sermon is found in Matthew 5-7 and is for me the seminal moment in the teachings of Jesus. Because this is his most extended, profound, broadest teaching we have recorded in all of Scripture. And it covers things that we like to talk about, yet deep down, we have challenges living. Sermon on the Mount, Episode 7, Part 2 for us, Praying to Our Father. So, bro, you mentioned something last week that really stuck out to me. I liked it. Mm-hmm. And that this prayer was more than just a starting point, more than just this simple prayer, something to try. That this is the essence of who Jesus was the pattern of his life, right? I like that a lot. Because actually this entire Sermon on the Mount, right, it's that whole pattern as well. Every single thing that he mentions, from the Beatitudes to the parables, they can all be seen actually played out in his real life that he lived, right? So his will question that he's posing, it his will question, is that an echo question? Follow me? It says, where else have we heard that God's will be done somewhere, right? And does this prayer remind them of that commitment? Because they had a point where God said, are you going to do my will? And they said, yes.
Well, said and did, dude.
Right.
Two different things.
Right.
Yes,
absolutely. And just like us, again, say and do are, yeah, there you go. Okay.
Even as you and I were talking earlier, when God gave them his prescription for what life should look like, 10 Commandments, laying out the law, kind of the seminal moment in Israel's, formation. This is who I want you to be. And it echoes back again to even the beginning of the prayer, which is about God's holiness. And we get this kind of weird belief that holiness is something, different than it literally just means set apart, different, distinct, unique. Mm-hmm. And that's what God knew, that's who he was, and that's who he wanted his people to be. Yeah. So he lays out this prescription to say, here's some guidelines for how to make that happen. Now, Israel said, great, let's do it. And then, of course, we see throughout history, they fail and fail and fail and fail. And obviously God, who is the author of story, loves to rescue and, comes in and we know the rest of the story, as we say. Yeah. But in there, Jesus kind of brings it back to God's will on earth as it is in heaven. This was God's desire all along, that we not only believe differently, but we think differently and we behave differently. And I've heard modern psychologists say that you don't think your way into good behavior, you behave your way into good thinking. And I thought that's really an interesting concept. I know. And it's
because it might be one of those weird loops, in a way, but I hear you on that. Sometimes you have to get up and do something before you have the will to get up and do something. Yeah.
Or, they talk about if you want to feel better, you got to get out and do something that moves you in that direction. You can't just say, I'm going to feel better kind of thing. Right. So, and again, we're talking psychology. We're not talking necessarily, what God says.
Right.
So that's kind of what this whole prayer is, transitioning us, guiding us into, is this different way of doing life.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, thoughts on that?
No, because when they have, and I like these comparisons to me, I keep looking back, and they just, so many echoes keep going back to the mountain. Okay, so you mentioned this set apartness, the holiness. There is a certain point from a point that also deals with a reverence, that there's an importance to the difference as well. That it has that set apartness has, we have to respect the purpose, right?
Right.
So that's a very good point, because we have that same moment at the mountain where he says, okay, now this is like Moses had before with the burning bush. He said, the bush is special. The place you're at special. Take your sandals off. You're on set apart ground. For the moment, this is set apart ground. And so the mountain there at Sinai, same thing. Don't go there. Man nor beast, said be careful, because blah, blah, blah. You know what fascinates me is in that story, and it's not a parable story. This is a real story, so we have to make sure that we make sure we clarify ourselves with this. That, ironically enough, the next thing that has to happen after that is forgiveness. Matter of fact, it's in the middle of the story that forgiveness becomes part of the equation. It's also interesting, and now that you mentioned it, it just hit me this way, that in that element, and that they end up acting out. And he tells Moses, he says, those people, he says, your people. The point it's really good in Hebrew, because it comes back and says, your people are doing that, right? It's like mom and dad talking about, your son just did this. Yes, mom said that to dad about me, I don't know how many times. Your son did this, yeah. And so, so that go down in that and so the forgiveness comes from God. But in that, you have to think about the community as a whole, and maybe that needed to happen across the board too. Meaning there were people that were doing it, maybe, because I'm not saying 100% of the people are biting on these. I'm not compelled, because we don't do it now. Why in the world would it have been different then? And so now we just got chewed out by God, and some people are hurt because they're the ones that were part of it. The other part are hurt because it wasn't my fault, And to Moses, it wasn't his fault. And that forgiveness had to go. It had to go. Picture Moses. Picture him having that he goes down, has to chastise his brother.
Yeah.
There's a lot in that. So I'm not shocked by this. And I wonder if that's an element maybe in this too. Maybe that they hadn't cut their own. Think about this. Now, it's going to be interesting. Cut your own history some slack. Forgive them. Forgive them. we're here, we're now, I'm here. This is Jesus saying, we're here, we're now, I'm here. And that just hit me, literally, just now. And I went, that's a poser of a thought, because that stretches them. And if you do this, again, this still goes with what had happened back there. And so the events happened, and now we're dealing with what we need to do around it. Unlike there, where that was the beginning, the birthing, I mentioned on my other episode, where we literally have a birthing event. We have passing through waters. We literally have, it's a practical metaphor. Is that such a thing?
Is that an oxymoron?
I don't know if that fits, a practical metaphor, but we do. So we literally have the birthing of a nation, right? They come out of Egypt through the Sea of Reeds, the birthing of water, and whoosh, they're there. And the very first thing they need is water and food. And so all that sustenance comes there. We're going to get to bread, right? So all of this is all happening. So that's the event that is, right? And everything that goes with it. So Jesus, in this whole Sermon on the Mount, is referring back to that event. That's where he says, but it's because, hey, Torah's not going away. This whole thing's wrapped around that. None of that can go away. And no jot, tittle, da-da-da. Sometime you and I have to talk about those jots and tittles things. That'll be a fun another episode, which will be cool, because it draws some cool stuff. But anyways, so all of that story is wrapped around this. And then how we're going to get through these elements are based on that behavior. They've seen it. He said, okay, but that was a birth. Those were infants. We're a long ways down now. So now I think Jesus expects more maturity here. So we're going past that. And he needs them to be mature, because they're going to be the big brother. Why? Because now all of a sudden you're going to have a whole boatload of infantile Gentiles. That would be us.
Yeah.
Infantile Gentiles. And I need you to be more, because you're the core. You're my people. Because that's who he's talking to. The audience that he's talking to is them for that purpose. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason I'm here. How do we take it forward? So, there's a lot in that.
Well, and think about their role as God's people at this moment when Jesus is talking to them both as his children, but then also trying to expand their vision for it was always meant to be bigger than just you. Right. You were simply to be the expression of me here.
Right.
And he talks about that in this prayer, that we're living in a way that brings heaven down to earth, which is what was intended. And he says, give us this day our daily bread, that reminder of when they were coming out of Egypt, he was the daily provider. They were dependent on him. And that is something God still intends, that we live a dependent life. Again, I go back to the probably one of the greatest disadvantages that our country has done to us is made us think we are independent people.
Yeah.
No, we're not.
Yeah.
Not as a nation, not as a social entity, but as children of God, we need him.
Yeah.
This whole relationship was always based on covenant. As we talked earlier, it was there. We do tend to, in the church today, talk about God's free gift of love, free gift of salvation. Everything comes without condition or expectation. And you're right. I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to earn salvation.
There's a difference, because they didn't earn their position. In other words, yes, but with that comes conditions. It does. Conditional behavior. It has, the garden had that. They didn't earn the right to be born. They didn't earn the right to be created. They didn't earn the right to be given the tasks that they were given. But being in the garden and all the benefits that came with it, right? Were conditional. When they're pushed out of the garden, it's still conditional. Right? Because then they get into death and what are they going to do? And that story just gets messier and messier and messier as it goes. And what he wants is this relationship. And name me a relationship, any relationship, that is unconditional.
Yeah.
The closest thing maybe that you could get, maybe, is the talk of the unconditional love of a mother. You know, that little phrase that we like to talk about, which I think that might get to, but that's from the mom, not from the behavior of the child. And I could say God unconditionally loves us, right? But in that, we were talking earlier that I like to watch a lot of foreign shows that have a subtitle. It doesn't matter. I'm hard of hearing anyway, so the reading helps me. I do it on English shows. But you have these points where the cultures cross over, and that conditional part that mom does or dad does, those things still have this underlying thing that needs to happen. And with God, it's the same way, that they can unconditionally love, but you're still going to get in trouble. There's still a consequence. The unconditional love, I'll bite. God's had that. But with that comes conditional consequence. You know, and I think what we call the church today, the Western churchianity side of things, has found a way to blur things and make it that now this side is unconditional. And I don't agree. I don't, for multiple reasons. But God has always had unconditional love.
Yeah.
And he reminds us through a little talk that we have a very famous verse that is a very private conversation. That was fascinating, that we forget. This thing that we wave around on a banner, guy says, if I were Nicodemus, I'd go, hey, why did you take something from my conversation? You know, kind of thing. John is listening at the stairwell and takes us back and says, hey, and he's telling a Pharisee, God's loved you and loved all creation unconditionally. So much so that what's going to happen here is going to tear him. If there was anything that made God sad, and lots of things that made God sad in history, we know, because he said it. We had a flood.
Yep.
So he's definitely capable of those feelings and the consequences that come with it. And he keeps reminding us in this prayer that there is those points. Now he says, give you an example. Meaning he says, okay, so let's walk this out. You want my Father's will. I want my Father's will. I keep saying, only my Father's will. I'm going to say it at the end in that prayer in the garden. It can't be mine because I don't want to do this.
Right.
It's got to be yours. So now my will said, okay, boof. Now you get to forgiveness. And then if you think that's a kick in the teeth, you know, as hard it is to make that conditional side. And he says, got to do your side first. We like to flip it. God forgives us, so I forgive others. And in the prayer, it's the other direction.
Yeah.
He flips it. And like we were talking earlier about that everything that Jesus mentions from the Beatitudes through all the parables, that he actually lives this in his life. That in that garden, he heals the ear of somebody that's wrongfully. Yeah, that's about as close to forgiveness as you're going to get. Yeah, including the famous utterance. God,
On the cross.
let all of them go. You know, and there is, in our practical world today, there is no bloody way we would tell people to say that.
Yeah. But think about even that imagery, and this is something I just thought of as you were talking as well. The words, and I have not looked at the Greek, so I got to see in terms of the tense of the verb and everything, but it says, forgive us our debts as we forgive, not when we, but as we,
Yeah.
which is an interesting usage. And so transpose that onto Jesus is on the cross. He's taking on the entire sin of the world. For him to fulfill that entire thing, he obviously has to die, but God has to, it's again, Jesus is saying, forgive them. Now God can forgive all.
Yeah.
So you've got that fulfillment of the very thing he's talking about with regard to prayer.
Yeah.
But then the other thing that I have to look at, and Tim and John mentioned this to some degree, is, and hang on, I wrote it down, and I like the way they said it. Forgiveness is like breathing. In order to take it in, we have to give it out. And it's kind of that example. I remember preaching this sermon years and years ago of Jesus setting aside his deity in order to become man. And he didn't consider it something to be grasped because he didn't have to. It's like he held it with open hands. And we can't receive something unless we let go of whatever it is we have, right? If I'm holding on to something, I can't take it, take something from you. So when we talk about this condition of forgiveness, it's almost more like a reality of the realization of the experience. When I forgive others, I have now opened myself up to that reality of what God is doing. And so it's more like Jesus does over and over again. I need to change the way you think. This isn't about a give and take. This is about being open to the reception of what God is doing kind of thing. And it's a different way of living. It's saying, hey, I don't want the thing we talked about before. I can say, I don't want to sin, I don't want to sin, I don't want to sin, I don't want to sin. And we're focused on the sin rather than I want to live like God intended. Sin isn't of an interest to me. I want to live in a way that says, you're going to offend me. I understand that. But when we forgive, then we both get to live in a different way of how do we then treat each other better? How do we then live better? So it's just, I just love the paradigm shift. And it takes the focus off of the negative and onto the positive.
And it's funny that's a great way to put it, because what you have with Torah and it because I think it approaches it that way. There's a number of things that are like the if statements. Protection. Don't make sure you put railings on your house because if somebody falls off, then you need to compensate. Those are those if happens. In other words, you're not focusing on the wrong. I'm focusing on what to do when Okay, and that's a great point. That whole shift of looking for being wronged. I'm not as good at it in life. Hopefully, I'm getting better at it. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about here. And it's on the soccer pitch when I was a pro ref. You couldn't, there was nothing you could do to offend me. You could say anything you wanted. Your mother wears army boots. Line of cuss words up and down the deal. And it's just not, you can't. Okay. And so then I could deal with and help work the relationships that are dynamically happening in a very compressed span of time with an expanded range of emotion. So the Dr. Don Wilber, when he first mentored me with this, he said soccer's a microcosm of life. If you look at it this way, and it helps me manage those pieces. I hope I've gotten better in life, in real life, to say that you're not going to offend me somewhere. That's not going to be the case. I'm not looking, because some people are looking for offense. They're looking for offense. They're looking for, because it gives them a reason to push away. And I'm working around those. I'm dodging the offenses because I don't want to be pushed away. I want that relationship. I want that connection, right? And God, I think God does that a lot with us. I do. There's a point where we thought, if you can't do this perfectly, then it can't be done. And it's like, but if you look at a Greek version of perfection, we have this great. But if it's with integrity and commitment, that all changes. That's like holy, looking at it to a point where it's a nebulous thing we can't think about. All of a sudden you realize it's set apart, it's special, and a purpose. Then you go, when you do that with all integrity, with all commitment. And then I look at his life. I look at Jesus's life, and I go, with all integrity, with all commitment. And you go, can I be like that? Is that possible? And you say, that's what we try for. And then, Jimmy, what you said is perfect. Because if I'm focused on that, then the obvious sin isn't the concern, where murder, adultery. I loved when the Ten Commandments, when you look at them, it's kind of fun, because we have them as 5 one-liners, but they actually only have a couple are really one-liners. The rest actually have more to them, because they get a little messier. Like, murder and killing, they're one line.
Right.
That's what it says, But the other ones, they get a little more if. So there's sacrifices when you come back to God and you say, look, I didn't realize, like you said, I'm not focused on sin, but I unintentionally did this. The majority of the stuff deals with these unintentional points where you go back and realize, I hurt somebody. I didn't mean to do it. And there's a restitution that I need to do. I need to go to them. I need to ask for forgiveness. My apologies. I did not intend to do that. And I hope not to do that in the future. Yeah. So my teshuvah, right? My repentant return. And then move on. And if I do that and stay focused, the other stuff's easy. You said something that I like, is that if we're focused that way, then that's not the point. And more people, I think, fight not following Torah than realizing that if you're focused what you just said that way, surprisingly, it's not hard.
Yeah.
We just like to figure out how far can we push the boundaries. How not to a stop can I do on a stop sign? How far over the speed limit can I go before I get caught? Or for how long can I go over there before I get caught? We're looking that way rather than the other way around. And I think what you just said is the key point here on that, and how we live with that. Yeah. Because that's going to be wrapped around this whole forgiveness thing. Because if you're doing that, then forgiving somebody else becomes easier. When we take our own ego out of the equation, I'm looking at the way God would, that God would want to do. The example that we've seen is how Jesus did.
Right.
We get a chance to have an opportunity to act differently, as you put it. Yeah.
And if we're trying to bring about God's kingdom on earth, as the prayer talks about, then our forgiveness should flow as freely as God gives it from heaven.
Right.
And so it should be a natural outpouring. Now, granted, like you said, it's not always going to be that easy, because we're going to be hitting times where it's going to hit our ego, and that kind of a thing. And there are times when it's going to be challenging. And even the next phrase talking about lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Again, it's that we know we not only have competing voices, forces, powers, however you want to state it from a biblical perspective. And even John and Tim talked about, whenever there's a choice, there's a voice. I loved that phrase because it's true. It's like we immediately have an opportunity to decide.
Yeah.
Are we going to go God's way? Or are we going to go the other way? And it's like there's only two ways. It's either God's way or anything else, everything else. Because it could be mine, it could be the enemy, it could be the social conditions, whatever.
Yeah.
Anything not God is everything else.
the other way. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. We have those choices, and I'm more of a it's our choice. In other words, I think everything's presented to us. This is me. This is Bob. I think things are presented to us. In other words, I get adversarial presentation laid out nicely, given for that deal, but the choice is still yours. He's not puppeteer. God's not puppeteering you, and adversarially you're not puppeteered. You get there that falls on your choice. The eases are egos, which you just mentioned. That's probably the biggest thing, because I think we feed the ego with. I think that's really the biggie. It's the id, the ego, and what we do with it and how we feed it, right? And in God's economy, He's always addressed things on a communal basis.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Even when he has to deal with individuals, it's for a greater audience. Whether he's working with the prophets, it's for the children, right? And when he's talking about a king, it's to rule. It's a greater deal. This isn't, I'm going to bless you and make you a hermit. It's not. It's the people that he did. We go back to Abraham and what he did and how he was blessed and what he did to show commitment for the blessing that he had. I wouldn't, truthfully, those that I hope they understood when Abraham told him, we're all getting circumcised because God said to do this. You're a slave. Okay.
Yeah.
You better hopefully be on board with Abraham's deal, because that's a whole nother discussion we could talk to later too, which would be a good one, mind you. But we have these points. So yes, I think on these and the choices that we have to make, and then where that takes us. And forgiveness is a huge point in that. And I think the thing I like the best in the example is that this was still Jesus's choice.
Yeah.
Because he makes it clear, even in his prayer, because he goes, in his final prayer, not this prayer, his final prayer, where he's going, look, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
So the me doesn't want to do this. But you are telling me this is the best. I have to believe you.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's what we get from God, whether we like it or not sometimes. That going through those things that get you. He's suffering for us, where we're usually suffering for ourselves and or the plight of others too. Like however that plays out. So this discussion's good. So this will definitely get us into said third, because again, we're not finished with this prayer yet. This will take us a bunch of different places. So thank you. This is great. We'll continue this, folks. So thanks for me with let's try talking again. Thanks for being with us tonight. Sermon on the Mount. We're going through this prayer, and I think we're having a great time to do it. Hang with us for part 3, and thanks you for being with us tonight on another episode of The Dusty Feet.